Now, let's start in New York, where the UN Security Council has voted against a US draft resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza linked to the release of hostages. Russia and China were amongst 3 countries that vetoed the US resolution. It was the first time the US had supported calls for an immediate ceasefire in the region, having previously used its own veto to block such demands at the UN. Well, this is how the US ambassador to the UN responded to China and Russia's veto.
Russia and China still could not bring itself to condemn Hamas's terrorist attacks on October 7th. Can we just pause on that for a moment? Russia and China refuses to condemn Hamas for burning people alive, for gunning down innocent civilians at a concert, for raping women and girls, for taking hundreds of people hostage. This was the deadliest single attack on Jews since the Holocaust. And a permanent member of this council can't even condemn it. I'm sorry, it's really outrageous, and it's below the dignity of this body.
That was the US representative there to the UN just speaking a short time ago. Well, we know that Mr. Netanyahu has been having talks with Antony Blinken, and he has said in a statement to after those talks, which has only recently broken up, we think, Mr. Netanyahu said we talking about going into Rafah. He said, Mr. Netanyahu said, I told him I hope we will do it with the support of the US, but if we have to, we will do it alone. We know that, of course, the US and other allies of Israel have been urging caution on that particular move. Well, let's speak to Mark Lowen, who is in Jerusalem for us. Mark, just first of all, on the UN resolution being vetoed initially, what is the impact of that, if any? And we also know that there is another draft resolution that's doing the rounds at the moment.
Well, it means that the resolution, of course, was not passed at the UN Security Council, Geeta, because Russia and China have veto-wielding power. Now, Russia's UN ambassador said that it was a false declaration of a ceasefire, false call for a ceasefire, because the text that was supported by the US linked a ceasefire to the immediate release of hostages. So in effect was supporting Israel's negotiating position in these talks in Doha, which are still ongoing, ceasefire talks, because Israel's position is that there can only be any ceasefire if the hostages, if Israeli hostages held by Hamas are immediately released. Now, even though the US basically was sort of in line with Israel's negotiating position, it was a harder tone than the US has used before. As you noted in your introduction, previously the US had vetoed 3 previous calls for an immediate ceasefire, and they'd never used those words, immediate cessation of hostilities. So, you know, the US was going further than they ever had, but still it was blocked by Russia, China, and Algeria. So it doesn't pass. There is a second ceasefire that draft that is going to be circulated. We don't know exactly how hard that will go. But all through this conflict, really, the UN Security Council has been paralysed by differing positions on the war and on Israel's position in the war and Israel's offensive. You know, we've seen the US hardened position growing increasingly exasperated with Israel, but even that, it seems, has not been enough to pass the deadlock of the UN Security Council.
And Mark, in terms of the talks that happened on the ground today, we've seen the Israeli Prime Minister, Mr. Netanyahu, coming out of those talks and saying that he still feels that they will have to go into Rafah in order to defeat Hamas. And if they have to do that without the support of the US, they would still go ahead. Do we have any more information as to how those talks went?
All we know is that they lasted about 40 minutes, that they discussed Rafah, as you say, which is in the south of Gaza, where more than 1 million people are now sheltering, and where the Israelis are determined to send in the military in defiance of international warnings about the atrocities that could ensue. They also talked about the urgent need to deliver, or from Blinken's point of view, an urgent need to ramp up humanitarian aid into Gaza amidst those dire warnings that we had earlier in the week about famine and catastrophic food insecurity facing the vast majority of people in Gaza. The US has summoned an Israeli delegation to to Washington next week to discuss Rafah. The US position is that Israel does not need to go into Rafah in order to destroy Hamas. There are alternatives, namely to cut off completely the smuggling routes coming from Egypt across the crossing into Gaza and feeding Hamas. But whether Israel buys that, we don't know. And at the same time as Israel is, Netanyahu is repeating almost every day his intention to go into Rafah, the ceasefire talks are continuing in Doha with the head of Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, there in Qatar, with the head of the CIA and Egyptian and Qatari negotiators. So Israel appears to be kind of keeping its options open, playing to different audiences. But clearly, if the Israeli military does go into Rafah, which probably could take quite a few weeks to organize, given the number of people who would need to be evacuated first, that would exacerbate the already very, very fractious relationship between the US and Israel.
And Mark, difficult question potentially for you to answer from where you are at the moment, so forgive me for asking, but do we have any real information about whether representatives of Hamas or, via any other Palestinian groupings are involved in these talks, these ceasefire talks? They are
in effect represented by the Qataris because their political wing of Hamas has been living in Qatar. Basically, the sort of political representatives of Hamas have lived in Qatar. So Qatar actually plays a double or an important go-between between the Israelis and Hamas, because even though they don't have official relations with Israel, they do talk to the Israelis, but they also give residency to top Hamas officials. Now, what we understand is that in order for an agreement on a ceasefire to be reached, they would need to actually have the green light from the head of Hamas in Gaza, who is Yahya Sinwar, and he is Israel's most wanted. He is believed to be the mastermind behind the 7th of October attacks. We don't know where he is. Probably in a tunnel somewhere, possibly surrounded by Israeli hostages. But given the communications blackout there, given the fact that he's trying to evade Israeli firepower, it's quite difficult, of course, for the Qataris or indeed the Egyptians to try to negotiate with him, or not necessarily negotiate with him, but to actually get his the words from the horse's mouth, if you like. So that is one of the hold-ups in the talks. And if there is to be a breakthrough in those talks, that would need to come from Hamas itself, not just from the Qataris and the Egyptians. So that is one of the reasons, Gita, why we are not expecting a breakthrough, today or tomorrow. It could take days, even weeks, for this to really move.